Hi, Mark. You ask a great question here, and it's a great question partially because it's a very, very difficult question to answer. You ask, is it possible for someone to be wise in one respect, and does that mean really that they're knowledgeable, or what exactly is the line between wisdom and knowledge? This is an excellent question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because it depends on how we answer what wisdom is, and that's very difficult. But I would suggest this. And I'd like to hear what you guys think, and I'd love for you to repost and tell me what you think about my response here. But I would say that wisdom is really something like knowing what to do. For instance, I tend to think that when I imagine someone who's wise, if I need help in making an important and a difficult decision, and I want to talk to someone who's wise, I go to them because I think that they know what I ought to do. And part of the reason I think that they know what I ought to do is because I think that they themselves do what they ought, right? Or in other words, think about Socrates. And we looked at the Euthyphro, or no, we didn't look at the Euthyphro, I'm sorry, though I gave it to you. But Euthyphro always seems to argue, at least in these early dialogues that seem to be historically accurate, that he doesn't know things. Yet, ironically, in the Apology, we saw that Socrates in fact says he's wise. Wise in the sense that he knows what he ought not, that he knows that he doesn't know, right? He's knowledgeable of his own ignorance, and in that sense, he's wise. Now, here's the deal, in this sense, is that I think that what's happening is that take notice of this also, that Socrates, what is Socrates important for, at least in terms of the history of philosophy? He's at least important for tying the question about nature to the question of virtue. Virtue is the question or the subject of how we ought to live. So Socrates is always concerned with the question of virtue. For instance, look at the Meno, when we did read that dialogue, or at least a selection of it. In the Meno, the question is all about virtue, how we ought to live. And we're going to look at the Republic here in a little bit, and or we did look at the Allegory Cave, but we'll come back to some of the issues of justice and that sort of thing later in the semester. But in there we see that the question of justice is really central to Plato and how we ought to live, and that's central to philosophy. So what is virtue? Virtue is human conduct. So I think, because there's two types of people, right? There's someone who knows what they ought to do, and who does it, and there's someone who knows what they ought to do and doesn't do it. We would tend to say that the person who knows what they ought to do but doesn't do it, so for instance, let's say, for example, someone knows that they have friends and their friends are peer pressuring them into helping them rob a convenience store. They know they ought not do it, but they do it anyway. We tend to think, I think at least in normal discourse, that person is foolish. But now take the other person. Take the person who's being peer pressured to do the same thing but says, no, I won't do it. We tend to think that person made a wiser decision. So in this respect, I feel like wisdom requires knowledge. But knowledge in and of itself, I would argue at least, is insufficient for wisdom, right? So knowledge is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for wisdom. So, and it's funny because if you look at, for instance, Plato often talks about knowledge and wisdom almost interchangeably, but not quite. The study of philosophy is a study of knowledge, but it's more than that, I think, at least after Socrates. It's a question of how we actually live, right? So it's about knowledge, but it's about action. So, I mean, this is my own interpretation of this question, which I have spent a lot of time thinking about, but I think it's a very difficult question, because in many ways, someone who's knowledgeable certainly has wisdom. Now, to your question in particular, you ask, what about the person who's knowledgeable in one subject? Are they wise? Well, I think we might say that they're wise in that subject if they know about that subject and they do correctly, they act correctly, or in accordance with their knowledge. Maybe that's what we would say wisdom is. Wisdom is action in accordance with knowledge. Now, the person who's utterly wise, I guess, would know how to act in all respects. That person clearly is very rare. I can't think of one person like that myself. But I think we can say that someone is wise in one respect, right? For instance, I can imagine for instance, take General Petraeus, who helped sort of kind of wind down the war in Iraq, and is now the head general in the war in Afghanistan. I would tend to think that he's a wise general. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's a wise husband, for instance. I mean, I don't really know what he's like as a husband, but I think we can make the distinction that he's a wise general, partially because he has knowledge, but he knows how to employ the knowledge in action. Is he wise in all aspects of his life? Probably not. And I think he'd probably be the first person to tell us the same. So it's an important question. I mean, ultimately, I guess the goal is to be that person, to be someone who's wise in all respects, or at least wise in most respects. So it's a great question, and I'd like to hear what you think. What's your definition of wisdom? And what's your definition of knowledge? What do you think the line between knowledge and wisdom is? Because it's a sticky issue, but as I think you know, it's a crucial issue. We have to give an account of it if we're going to continue to talk about wisdom or knowledge in these respects. Okay? Well, I leave it there, and I thought it's a great question, so I posted a video, and I look forward to hear your responses. Okay? Talk to you guys soon. Bye.